Hi there, you're watching BQ Prime and this is the Fine Print. 2 weeks ago, a new regulatory framework was notified to govern the overseas investments by Indian corporates and residents. Now that lawyers have had some time to assimilate and absorb the new changes, we're kicking off a special series to better understand the commercial implications for Indian corporates and entities with overseas ambitions. Joining me today is Ashwath Rau, Senior Partner at AZB, with his views on where the devil is in the details and what possibilities the government and the RBI have opened up for Indian resident entities. Ashwath, welcome to the Fine Print. While we're covering three key issues in this conversation at a slightly more macro level, how are you viewing the new sort of framework?
So I think it's fundamentally streamlining, Payaswini. So what they've done effectively is taken a lot of feedback that they must have received during the course of the operational dealing with of overseas investment by Indians, and there have obviously been a number of requests of clarification addressed to ADs, to RBI. Some have been provided on a case by case basis. Some were the subject matter of interpretation. So I think they've drafted the new regime well. Most of what you need really, to my mind, is in the rules itself. There's some stuff in relation to debt and security creation in the regulations, and the master directions, as always, I think contain detail which is more operational in nature. But most of what you need is in the rules itself, right? So I think they've streamlined the regulatory framework, if you will, for overseas investment. And I think there's a combination of streamlining, which is, I think, more order, if you will, in the regulatory framework. There are some positive changes, which we'll talk about. And then there are some sort of, I won't say negative changes, but there are some changes which are more restrictive in nature.
Yeah.
The enabling, I think, is certainly there, but the disabling is also there in equal measure. I won't say that one is more than the other.
Okay, so let's sort of dive straight into the three issues that we are here to discuss today. One is the distinction that they tried to do between overseas direct investment versus overseas portfolio investment. And for the benefit of our viewers, I'll just take them through in very sort of non-legalese terms what ODI versus OPI is. 10% or more in a equity of a listed entity, offshore listed entity, is ODI. Anything less than 10% but with control is ODI. All unlisted investments is ODI. Offshore unlisted debt is ODI. What's offshore portfolio investment? Anything which is not ODI, which means less than 10% in a foreign listed entity and listed debt. What are we achieving here by crafting this distinction?
So firstly, I think this falls into the streamlining bucket. I don't think there are any enabling changes that they've really made. There are some disabling, or at least one disabling. The best way to look at it, to my mind, is look at it from the point of view of the investor. Don't look at what it is invested in.
Yeah.
And if you look at it from the standpoint of the investor, you have three categories broadly of investors from an ODI perspective, which is listed companies, Indian listed companies, Indian unlisted companies, and individuals. Now, if you look at Indian listed companies, I think they've only reiterated what is already there, right? They've given clarity, which I think is helpful because it also covers the ability of an Indian listed entity to invest in listed debt.
Yeah.
But I think the window of 50% of net worth, to my mind, is really relevant only for Indian listed companies.
Yeah.
Which is basically then going to be a benefit of the 400%. And possibly an argument to say that 50% incremental to that.
Yeah.
So listed companies have a 450 window, 450 of net worth window, and they can basically go into the category you mentioned, which is effectively sub 10% in a foreign listed entity and even listed debt, provided that as far as the listed equity investment is concerned is sub 10% and doesn't have any special rights associated with it. It would qualify as OPI. And that's what an Indian listed entity can do. You look at an Indian unlisted entity.
Just before you get to unlisted, the 400% you're talking about is the net worth requirement of the ODI. Now they have said if you are an OPI investor, you can't do more than 50% of your net worth essentially
So for an
speaking?
Indian listed company, it
Yeah.
means for ODI you have 400%,
Yeah.
and for OPI you have another 50%,
50% over and above the 400%.
which is why I said 450
Got
effect.
it. Yes.
So the second category of investor, which I don't think is benefiting at all from this new classification, is an Indian unlisted company.
Okay.
An Indian unlisted company would benefit only if it had the ability to remit capital. And
Yeah.
if you read the fine print carefully, it very clearly says that effectively they have the ability to do things like rights issue, which is of course a remittance but on a rights basis,
Yeah.
or bonus, which is in any event not a security, or capitalization of dues, or when there are shares issued pursuant to a scheme of merger, demerger, amalgamation, right? And there's one more category. But all of these actually swap. So all of these are for existing investments really by Indian unlisted entities, right? And you're really not creating a new window for them. So to my mind, the OPI window is not relevant for Indian unlisted. Then you go to Indian individuals, and before you get excited, the first thing they really say is the limits under LRS apply,
Yeah.
right? So frankly, you're not really getting flexibility to do anything incremental to what you as an individual could have already done under the liberalized remittance scheme in any event, right?
In fact, there is a disabling
Retrograde change.
Yeah.
The retrograde change is basically, since when you're talking about unlisted, and if an individual wants to invest in listed, he always could have done it, he could still do it.
Yeah.
But if he had to go through an unlisted pooling vehicle,
Yeah.
right, or going through an unlisted company,
Yeah.
you have the FS prohibition which comes into play. An
Yeah.
individual cannot do FS
Financial
effectively.
services, yeah.
And then if it is a pooling vehicle, like a fund framework, it has to be a regulated fund framework, which
Yeah.
may not be the case, for example, in structures that we see in the market today, where you and I, under the $250,000 per year LRS limit, can invest into, say, a pooling vehicle, which then disperses that money in equal measure in, say, 5 listed stocks like Apple and
Microsoft
Google
and Google, yeah.
you know, that lot.
Yeah.
But the whole problem is that intermediate structure is now ruled out.
Yeah.
So you'll have to go directly into listed equity, and you can't go into a holding company
Yeah.
because that will become FS, and that is restricted for an individual
Yeah.
under the OPI framework. So net, I think pretty much the same regime for listed, no real flexibility for unlisted,
Yeah.
and a little bit of a disadvantage for individuals.
So practically speaking, a lot of LRS investments that were happening directly into, let's say, listed, or typically people would do these pooling vehicles. I mean, what's the market practice?
You had a combination of both, and you
Okay.
know, for somebody, a person like me who's not necessarily in the investment world, right? What I would do is I would rely on a wealth manager,
Yeah.
probably a foreign wealth manager or a portfolio manager, to basically invest that money for me. And some of the structures that they use is basically to take that money into a pooling vehicle, as opposed to basically taking my money and putting it
directly
into
into
the
stocks
underlying
directly.
stock directly. Now the
Yeah.
whole problem is the pooling vehicle is basically
Unlisted.
negated.
And this pooling vehicle, are there options for it to get registered and then qualify for your and my money?
No, so they basically say that it has to be regulated by a financial services regulator.
Yeah.
And for that to basically happen, if the standard applied is what the RBI has applied as the standard previously, firstly speaking, many jurisdictions may not even qualify. So a lot
Yeah.
of the tax havens, quote unquote, may not qualify. And RBI may turn around and say effectively financial services regulators recognized by me. So if, for example, you're going into an SEC regulated fund, you're okay. But if
Yeah.
you're going into an unregulated fund, so if you're going into a mutual fund, no problem.
Yeah.
But will this come in the way potentially of Indians, both companies as well as residents, investing in PE and venture capital funds? Possibly.
Elaborate on this.
Because if you look at most private equity or venture capital funds globally, they are unregulated. Even in the US, for example, you rely on an exemption
Okay.
from registration with the US Fed
Okay.
or the US SEC, not Fed, the US SEC. You rely on an exemption to basically be unregulated.
Okay.
So if it is an unregulated fund, you technically won't meet the requirement here. So you will not be able to go into it. And I'm making the practical point that a number of the private equity and definitely venture capital funds that I have seen overseas are not regulated.
Okay. Okay. So, I mean,
Then it will go into the realm of interpretation where, for example, in a private equity fund, so for example, I mean, not that $250,000 is a limit that's going to enable you to do it. But if you, for example, wanted to invest in a KKR, or a Carlyle or a Warburg or whatever it may be, they may have managers which are basically US SEC registered as investment advisors or some other category. Those funds may qualify.
Okay.
But that would tend to be the exception in the PE world rather than the norm. Whereas in the mutual fund world, for example, whether it's a Fidelity, Vanguard or a BlackRock, that registration would be the norm for a mutual fund because it's public retail money, as opposed to private money, which, like in India, I mean, we still regulate it now under the AIF framework, but is either subject to lesser regulation or no regulation.
Okay.
Venture capital is subject to even less regulation. So I think the long and short of it here is basically, these rules could potentially come in the way of even enabling portfolio investment by either of the two categories which could have hitherto have done it, which is effectively listed, which I think is status quo. I think the complications are really for individuals under the LRS, which was actually, I think, more enabling than
currently
the
what
OPI framework.
Okay, all right. So rich HNIs like you will now need to get on a call with your wealth manager.
No, not me.
So the second sort of clarity that has come in is for ODI FDI structures, which in common parlance is known as round tripping, where basically an Indian entity which is investing in a foreign company either already has investments in India or is wanting to make investments in India. Now, so far you would take or require prior RBI permission to do something like this. Now the rules say that you can do such investments without RBI approval as long as the entire structure doesn't have more than 2 layers of subsidiaries. Just first, can you take us through what's the commercial need for such structures?
So, I mean, at the end of the day, if you look at the regulatory concern around round tripping, to put it very bluntly, it was to deal with money laundering. Where you basically had people, effectively, receiving illicit payments offshore for things that they were obviously doing here in India, and then figuring out structures to basically bring that money back here. The whole purpose of saying round tripping was not permitted came from that regulatory concern. At the same time, the way I think the RBI correctly articulated it was ODI means investing outside and FDI means investing inside. So if you're doing both, it's not really either, right? It's a khichdi and we are not okay with it. That actually at a practical level created huge problems because, even when you had a Tata or a Reliance or a Birla going out and acquiring a foreign company, more often than not, we are the world's back office, right? So there'd be an R&D center or there'd be, a research center, there'd be something floating around in India through a subsidiary. And you run into the round tripping issue. Similarly, if you look at, the current fad, which is basically blank check companies. I forget what they're called.
SPACs.
SPACs. So when you speak of SPACs, the very concept of a SPAC is a foreign vehicle whose actual value is derived from
the
an Indian operating company effectively, and more often the Indian operating company is set up by an Indian entrepreneur or a founder or a promoter, right? And then when you basically sought to give the Indian entrepreneur the interest in the SPAC, it became a problem because again round tripping came in. So there are innumerable structures which you are aware of, you mentioned one in an earlier discussion as well, where there were legitimate structures where there is reason for having the holdco, if you will, offshore, because maybe access to better liquidity and price discovery in offshore capital markets could be a reason for why that structure exists. It could be because frankly the business is primarily situated outside of the country. There were very many legitimate structures which had nothing to do with either tax avoidance or money laundering or anything of that nature, which were getting hit by the round tripping rule. Now the beauty of it is the round tripping rule was never codified. There was an FAQ by the Reserve Bank which basically said, sorry, round tripping cannot happen. And there was a lot of interpretation in relation to what is round tripping. If 99% of that company's value is overseas and 1% is in India, is the tail going to wag the dog?
Correct.
And it created a lot of frustration. So I think one of the biggest changes, and I think it's a substantive change, is clarity on what constitutes restricted round tripping and what is normal commercial business structures, which
because a lot of investors, overseas investors, may even be more comfortable investing in the holdco overseas compared to, let's say, directly in India.
That is right.
Okay. So now help me understand, they've this new two layers of subsidiaries rules.
So
In
there
the
are many
last 2
interpretations.
weeks,
Yeah.
what have the umpteen interpretations on 2 layers of subsidiaries have you guys discussed?
No, I mean, the extreme interpretation, which I think is not sustainable, is to say that, look, if an Indian invests in a foreign entity, that foreign entity cannot have more than 2 layers of subsidiaries anywhere in the world.
Yeah.
Right? I don't think that is the intent. I think if you look at the language, it basically says that foreign entity, when it invests or has already invested into India, cannot have more than 2 layers. Right?
Yeah.
So even there's an interpretation,
Yeah.
which is, do you only count the subsidiary layers outside of India, or you only count the subsidiary layers inside of India?
Yeah.
And I don't think there's any legal basis to take either view.
Okay.
So I think the correct view is to basically say that, look, if an Indian resident, individual or entity invests in a foreign entity under the ODI route, because this doesn't apply to OPI,
Yeah.
that foreign entity, if it has an investment in India, in that structure of its India investments, cannot have more than 2 subsidiaries. And those would include both offshore subsidiaries as well as onshore subsidiaries. So very simply put, if you have a foreign entity X, which is basically sitting with a foreign subsidiary Y, then effectively the only subsidiary it can have in India is company A, which in turn has no subsidiaries underneath it. Or X could invest directly in A, and A could have B, which is a subsidiary in India. But net, when you look at a foreign entity in which an Indian investor has gone in, right, that foreign entity cannot have an investment in India which has more than 2 layers underneath it as subsidiaries.
Okay, so like back up a little, there is an Indian entity which is already investing in the foreign entity, right? So this Indian entity sort of becomes the parent in your language?
No, that's not the rule.
Okay.
I'm saying the investor entity is kept out of the picture.
Okay, investor
Right.
entity is out. You start with the foreign entity.
Suppose the Indian entity was becoming the parent of that foreign entity.
Yeah.
Luckily, you ignore the Indian parent.
Okay.
You start with the foreign entity, which
Yeah.
is now a subsidiary.
Correct.
And you look under it,
Yeah.
inwards into India.
Correct.
Right?
Yeah.
That particular trail of the foreign entity
Yeah.
coming into India cannot have more than 2 layers.
Outside or
After coming
inside?
into India as well.
After coming into India.
Because as I said, you can either say the layers are only outside India or the layers are only in India, and I'm saying the language doesn't support either.
Okay.
So you take both effectively. I
Okay.
think is the better view to take unless the regulator clarifies otherwise.
Okay. So also, like we discussed, when we're talking subsidiary.
That's a problem, and
Yeah.
I don't think it was intended.
Yeah.
But this is a function of having defined ODI in a very innovative way,
Yeah.
where they basically have a concept of control as well.
Threshold and
Where control,
Yeah.
unfortunately, has been defined as anything over 10%.
Yeah.
And then the subsidiary definition under the ODI rules refers back to control.
Yeah.
As a result of which, now, if one were to just interpret the rules literally,
Yeah.
when you say 2 layers of subsidiaries, it is any entity in which the foreign entity either has 10% or more, or sub 10% with special rights. Then it is deemed to be in control, and therefore any entity that it is deemed to be in control in that manner is treated as subsidiary level 1, and anything beneath that entity is treated as subsidiary level 2. Now, this would result in, I think, unintended consequences, where effectively if that foreign entity has invested, let's say, in a substantive Indian entity,
Yeah.
like one of our top listed companies, that company in turn may have subsidiaries
Yeah.
which satisfies the level 2 requirement, which those subsidiaries may have some investments in the ordinary course, which are either in a JV or in an associate company, which are 10%, 20%, 30%. So I think one of the things which hopefully will get clarified by the regulator, I think sooner rather than later, is the subsidiary test remains the subsidiary test under company law, and you will not apply the subsidiary test that
Of
has been
control.
created under the rules,
Okay.
the ODI rules,
Okay.
hopefully.
Okay, so you've explained to me several interpretations that are potentially possible, that are more commercially sound than not. What possibilities now open up for people, well-intentioned corporate entities?
I think today, for example, this is a big change because it enables tax structures.
Yeah.
does it create complications where the business structure that is already in existence has more than 2 layers? I think there is that problem. Does it enable you to put in intermediate vehicles offshore? The answer is possibly no. But even the value today, after what happened with the Mauritius Treaty and the Singapore treaties, of basically routing investments in India through any particular jurisdiction has now limited benefit.
Yeah.
So that may not be fatal, but the problem is if you have a structure where an Indian entity acquires an offshore entity, which in turn has a substantive investment in India, that may be the only situation where this 2-layer complication may come in if you have a conglomerate, for example, with multiple businesses and operating layers in India. Save for that, I think if you look at it in the context of at least cases that I have seen in the past where this round-tripping issue became a problem, I think this change resolves it. By and large, I think you're going to have a number of people who were hit by the round-tripping problem having greater flexibility. I think one area where the round-tripping problem was a problem was for Indian principals in these private equity funds where they were investing offshore in carry units, right? Now the problem is, I don't know whether it was intended or unintended. Whilst the round-tripping issue is gone, I think because of the OPI, concept, I think your Indian PE professionals who basically have to invest in carry have had their life made more complicated. But that's, I think, a independently, large topic for discussion. But the limited point I was making was they were hit by the round-tripping problem earlier, which now has gone away. So definitely a welcome change.
Ashwath, the third sort of important change has come in for financial services investments. Now they are saying that even if you are not a financial services entity in India, you can invest in overseas financial services sector, barring, I think, insurance and banking. How much of, let's say, enabling sort of framework is this?
This, outside of the round-tripping clarification, I think is one of the most welcome big changes in the rules. But again, I trouble you to basically look at it in 3 categories of investors. An Indian entity which is FS, financial services, i.e. regulated by a financial services regulator in India.
Sorry, before you break this bucket, again for the benefit of our viewers, financial services is defined as anything that in India will require you to either register or be regulated by a financial regulator. Please go on.
So you have category number 1, which is an Indian financial services entity, i.e. regulated or registered with an Indian financial services regulator. Category 2, an entity which is not a financial services entity as above. And category 3, individuals, right? I think in 2 categories, as far as the FS regulated Indian entity category is concerned, the rules remain exactly the same as they were earlier. There's no change. As far as individuals is concerned, you remember I discussed this in the context of ODI, OPI. I think it's actually become more complicated.
Correct.
Right? But the big change is they've effectively said that if you are a non-FS Indian entity, you effectively can go into an offshore FS entity without any permission from anybody, subject to your only having a 3-year profitability track record. And the beauty of it is, if you don't have it during the COVID years, you're okay. You can go back to before the COVID years, right? And you could make the investment. In fact, the restriction is you can't do banking and insurance. But if, for example, you were, hypothetically Tata Motors, who's setting up a, Tata Motors operating subsidiary hypothetically in Europe, and that particular company, because it's the market practice in Europe or otherwise, basically wants to be able to also do car insurance. Right? That's general insurance. They've clarified that an Indian non-FS entity can basically set up a offshore health or general insurance business, provided it is ancillary to your core activity. So if you are a car manufacturer, basically doing car insurance would have been ancillary to your core activity. But more importantly, what this does basically is it basically allows Indian, entities to do offshore FS investments without any problem under the ODI route itself.
And practically, where do you see this sort of getting utilized the most? What kind of financial services investments?
I see this as a big fillip actually for family offices.
Okay.
So we as a country have, very wealthy promoters and entrepreneurs who basically have their family offices, which are now in many cases investing, corpuses which are $1 billion plus.
Okay.
They were struggling effectively with, how do they set up their offshore investment activities. Many of them wanted to basically set up, say, a family office. Some of them have done it through different innovative structures. Say, for example, as a Singapore, holding company.
Got it.
Which would be then MAS regulated, which would then basically invest all over the world.
Yeah.
This now enables those structures, right? And effectively allows, if you will, not only, Indian, I don't know how much of a benefit allowing an Indian non-FS entity to get into FS is going to be. But actually, I think what this really does is open up the door to basically making foreign investments, right? And may well be the way for Indian unlisted companies, right, to effectively do some portfolio investment by effectively setting up a holding company, overseas, provided the activity of that company meets the requirement under the ODI regulation, which is bona fide business activity.
Ashwath, final words as a result of, let's say, the rules getting changed and liberalized, clarifications, like we were also talking about offline, that, I think people want to bring money to India for, their businesses. You see more activity on the ODI, FDI front?
I mean, I think the short point over here is, given what the world is going through right now, and we've been out on the road meeting our clients in different jurisdictions. The general feeling is that India is one big bright spot in a otherwise gloomy global environment because of recession and everything around it. And the general belief is there are capital inflows, that are going to come in. So my sense is, these rules are ODI related.
Yeah.
I think you're still going to predominantly see FDI into the country. But having said that, there's a lot of wealth creation and capital that we have in our country as well. And there are businesses looking for, geographical diversification who've anyway been doing ODI on an as needed basis, particularly to acquire technology, more technology, more talent rather than markets, because we have a large enough market over here. I think you're going to see more of that. And I think, the streamlining, and there are a number of other changes which are small, which are very helpful, clarificatory in nature, where you don't have to go back to the RBI for write-offs, etc., which are going to now make Indian businesses with overseas businesses, the life of them far simpler.
All right. We'll of course get into those changes in the next few episodes of our special series on overseas direct investments framework. Ashwath, many thanks for patiently explaining some of these granular details to us and the viewers. Thank you for joining us here on BQ Prime, and thank you so much for watching.